Welcome everybody to another episode of the Lifters League podcast, the Muscle and Strength Science podcast. My name is Ben Ashmole. I'm joined here, as always, by elite powerlifting and strength coach Gus Cook, and we got some awesome guests today. Hey, Gus.
So today we got Kyle and Brandon from Kabuki Strength. Brandon's the head coach and director of education. All right.
Yep.
And Kyle is also a strength coach. What is your title, Kyle? There.
Coach. I do sales for the company too. I graciously gave myself the senior international coach title.
Oh, nice.
Really, I am one of our head strength coaches, main strength coaches.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess some of the things I've been excited to get you guys on because the things I'm most interested about your guys' approach is definitely how you guys utilize more data science-based methods to approach into programming. So I was hoping we're going to have a bit of a programming discussion. Hopefully it can lead into a few other things I've been watching you guys about and wanted to pick your brain on. I guess one of the first things that's been on my mind, especially during this whole pandemic, I've had to take a very long off-season approach to a lot of the powerlifters I've got, and so over time developing, I guess unique and different methodologies. I mean, what do you guys do for let's say a long off-season approach to powerlifting? How do you progress? So what kind of methodology you guys use?
Well, I think it depends on the specific situation. With the instance of this, hey, sorry, are you guys getting a lot of feedback on this?
A little bit.
A little bit, but not much.
Okay. Yeah, just let me know if it gets bad. I'm not really sure what's causing that. So in the case that it's this coronavirus stuff, a lot of people don't have access to their gyms or normal training equipment. There's really not a lot you can do, unfortunately. There's not a lot you can do to replace resistance like a barbell would, like a barbell uses. One strategy that we've used for athletes who are out of the gym, they don't have normal training equipment, is to use BFR. BFR training, blood flow restriction, or some people call it occlusion training, is a great way to stimulate similar muscle fibers as are used in really heavy weight training, but you need minimal equipment. In fact, you can even use body weight to get a similar effect. Now, the main effect is acute. There is a small systemic effect with BFR training, but it's not going to give you these same neuromuscular coordination benefits that hard barbell training would. So it's a good option, but it's not great, I would say. Beyond that, we can do a lot from a movement standpoint, but that's only going to take people so far. Unfortunately, with a lot of the restrictions, people not having access to their regular training, there's just not a ton that you can do.
Tell us a little bit more about this blood flow restriction. I mean, how's that particularly stimulates growth? I mean, restricting blood flow to a
so
training.
One of the myths is that it's similar to a tourniquet, and it's not. So a lot of old school bodybuilders or strength athletes would just tie knee wraps or floss bands around a joint, and they would use those. However, the problem with that is that you can't control the tightness of the wrap consistently. So from left to right, you can't control it. Well, you can make it tighter or not, but you don't have a way of measuring that, which can be a problem. There is a potential to cause nerve damage, among other things, if the wrap is too tight. So anytime you use BFR cuffs, you have to use BFR cuffs. Or if anytime you use BFR training, you have to use BFR cuffs. There's a lot of manufacturers selling pretty good ones right now. They're a little pricey, but you can pick up a set in the $500 range, which is what we sell as the B3 Sciences cuff. But the high and low on BFR training is by reducing the venous outflow of blood, you increase the amount of metabolites within that local area. You're really able to get into some of the muscle fibers that are more active at heavier weights. There's a ton of science that other people can probably speak to that better than I can, but it can be a very effective way to supplement your training. Kyle's using a little bit of that in his training right now for a few reasons, but there's different recommendations on how to use it based on the sport, based on the athlete themselves. You can really stimulate a ton of acute damage with BFR training, or you can potentially not if done properly. So
is it better focused for more muscle recruitment or strength?
Yeah, it really
just more
comes down
potentiation?
to how good an athlete is at shuttling metabolic waste. So if you have an athlete who is more endurance based, you have someone like a CrossFitter or someone who can tolerate very large amounts of volume, they probably aren't going to get super sore from BFR training. But if you take a powerlifter who has been doing low volume work and you do BFR training really intensively, it can be very damaging from a muscular damage and from a stimulating hypertrophy standpoint.
I guess how about a different approach then, because competitions have been a little bit more scarce here. So, but a lot of us still have access to gyms right now.
So it's probably worth kind of qualifying that. Obviously, you guys are in the States. We're here in Australia. We're specifically in Queensland, where we've been blessed with very few cases. So we're kind of open. We're still socially distancing, but we're pretty much open, right? The gyms are open.
Yeah, but there's been no competitions. I think there's been one. So a lot of the athletes I work with, I mean, most of the time they're probably going to at least compete like twice a year or so. So normally, the off season time or the time away from competition, perhaps only like anywhere between 3 maybe up to 5 months at a time before they come in getting ready for another competition. So I mean, so a lot of these people have been forced to take now 12 plus months or so. So what are your guys some approach with obviously access to the gym, or just long term, or just general approach to long term off season training?
Well, I think one of the unique things that this has provided, whether somebody has gym access or not, as a coach, I always have my goals for my athletes. They always have their goals, and those should obviously intermingle, and those should match at some point in time. But when we're forced to take a step back outside of my plan, outside of their plan, and look at long-term development, Brandon talked on, movement quality and technique work. It allows us the opportunity to look deeper at the program. What's missing? What does this athlete truly need from a developmental standpoint versus, we only have 3 months, so they need this, but we have to get them to point A in 2 months, in 3 months. So it's provided a very unique opportunity for us to, that's what we do best is, custom one-on-one training to look more in depth. What does the athlete need in long-term development? And the other with a lot of meets being canceled, I know I was looking at doing 2 more this year, and I told Brandon for my programming, we're just going to put it on the date or on the calendar and just pick a date because I want to continue to move forward. So the strategy is fairly the same. I'm not going to be on the platform, but I'm going to be in the gym working up to, testing and peaking. But if it wasn't for that, just sticking with the numbers, the biggest thing that I look for right now is the opportunity to look deeper into their development outside of time constraint goals, because it's kind of open right now. So unique opportunity to dive deeper into what they, maybe truly need from an athlete standpoint versus what do we want in short-term progress.
Yeah, and for me, it's similar. Kyle, can you mute yourself when I'm talking? For me, it's similar. I also take more of an approach to muscular development. That's way better. I was hearing myself twice in my ears. Anytime we have a really long off season for strength athletes, my number one focus, assuming that they don't need some ultra restorative phase, is to build muscle. So I usually have a conversation with them about this because you kind of have to let go of some of the comp lifts. We'll use things that are larger ranges of motion, and we'll intentionally use large range of motions in all movements. The squat tends to have a similar range of motion regardless of exercise you choose, because you're really squatting as deep as you can or to depth. A deadlift, though, we can use deficit deadlifts. We can do things in higher volumes such as RDLs. Stiff leg deadlifts are two of my mainstays in almost all off-season programs. I love loading up a ton of volume in those two movements. They tend to be pretty safe, and they can really blow up lifters' hamstrings, lower backs in a good way. And then for the bench press, it's really all about flat back bench pressing with a duffalo bar, bench pressing on an incline bench with various grips, Cadillac bar, things that increase the range of motion. And most all accessory exercises are focused in that same vein. Whenever I look at exercises for hypertrophy for strength athletes, we look at things that have a very high mechanical advantage, things such as barbell movements, but things that are in large ranges of motion. So I don't want to do things like tricep kickbacks and complete isolation movements like that. I'd rather do flat back, close grip bench presses. I'd rather do medium grip duffalo bar, buffalo bar presses, things that use really large ranges of motion to stimulate more hypertrophy. They're going to get stronger doing that too. And they're going to have a pretty quick reacclimation to heavier weights because they can shorten the range of motion. But a lot of the training is really focused around that. We'll also take the time to really train movements heavy, but in very low ratios. So if I have someone who, is taking 8 months away, I can't necessarily take, even though that's kind of a long time on paper, if you figure there's going to be, 3 months of competition prep, you have to go through a couple strength phases during that time too. You really don't have all that. You don't have 8 months of hypertrophy training, 8 months to get big. So we need to use maintenance styles of loading, and that's not that doesn't imply low volume loading. Maintenance loading to me is maintaining some type of training adaptation from a prior block. Most of the times, prior blocks in this situation are strength blocks. So that doesn't necessarily mean we're doing hard competition variations, but if we're 8 to 12 months out, I might ask my guys to do a very hard snatch grip block deadlift. It's like singles, doubles, triples, things that are very mechanically demanding, but ultimately they're not going to be that heavy. They're still going to force the athlete to strain really hard, which is what I'm looking for. And so we might include that in a very low ratio, though. It has to be a ratio that doesn't interfere with the amount of volume they're capable of accumulating. So if somebody can do, 20 hard sets of deadlifts in a week, and that's across all barbell variations, I don't want to do something like a deficit deadlift to a single for their maintenance loading, because that's likely to cause a large pool of fatigue, which will negatively impact how much total volume they can do, because volume is still the number one driver for us that far out in those large range of motion movements that are very highly that have a high mechanical advantage or are very mechanically stimulating. There's another word that I'm looking for there. It's not that. It's, if we think of barbell lifts versus isolation movements, even though it's like muscle building time, we're still not doing a ton of, just purely isolation movements. We're doing big barbell lifts for high volumes, things that they can accumulate a lot of volume in. And that takes up the majority of the year. Of that phase anyway. We'll still do some hard stuff in there, but it's a lot of volume in really big range of motion lifts.
How are you accumulating? Do you accumulate the total volume of all variations in say like a deadlift movement, and you're looking at progressing overall volume, overall tonnage for barbell-based deadlift movements?
Yeah. It always kind of depends on how you want to look at it. I do typically look at barbell variations, but even then, it's not always that reflective, because if I'm doing tons of good mornings versus tons of barbell rows or even RDLs, it just still gets kind of messy. So I'm still looking at a few lifts and progressing those lifts, and I'm going to assume that everything else that they're doing in their training plan is kind of filling in any gaps. So if we're deadlifting in an off season, we still probably only have like 2 main exercises that we're really looking to progress, and everything else is kind of filler. It could be our deficit deadlifts, it could be RDLs, it could be stiff leg deadlifts, it could be snatch grip deadlifts, which I have been really liking the past probably year for a lot of guys. Those are going to be my main lifts that I'm really looking to progress. I've even been doing a lot of RDL type movements, but we call them like deficit stop and go deadlifts without touching the floor. So they're kind of like a full range of motion RDL. It's great for accumulating a ton of volume. I think if you look at the totality of volume, it gets very messy and it's not useful. But if we look at just a few lifts and over the course of a block to block, if I can add like 1 set or 2 sets to each of those over the course of 2 blocks, without dramatically increasing fatigue, then we've probably done a really good job. So they're not massive changes that are happening, but even when you increase the range of motion of a movement, it's kind of like adding another set to your lower range of motion movement. It's not, you'd have to do the math on the range of motion there, but over time it does add up.
So you'll pick the ones you want to count, like, or high load kind of, or high stress exercises, and then keep the accessories like a lat pull down separate.
Yeah, exactly. And I very rarely look at total volume too. Anytime I talk total volume and things of that nature, it's more or less in the sense of description. So when we say volume, people imply that means work. So I don't always mean volume, sets times reps times load. The variables that I monitor the most closely are the average loading of my lifters, within a parameter of number of reps completed. So say they're, in a given training block, high volume training block, they might be doing 8, 7, 6s. I'm not going to look at anything beyond those. And I want to look at the average load improvements they make, as well as the rate of difficulty increase. And if we see average loading going up over the course of a few blocks without their difficulty skyrocketing, we'll look at total number of sets completed. But sets only really gets us to a specific difficulty number that we want. We use a 1 to 5 scale, and we look at average load. I look at average load. Kyle might look at other things. I look at average load, average number of reps completed, and the rate of difficulty increase to gauge progress over the course of multiple blocks.
So just to clarify, you're looking at the total load for that single, I guess, exercise, and you're progressing that you're only tracking to progress that within a rep range, we'll say between 6 and 8. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think I've seen you guys do that with, looking at your guys' programs, do that with RPE as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How does that work for you guys?
Yeah, it's really similar. So RPE, we use an RPE scale. So we very rarely tell people to add a 9 or add a 10. We're usually telling them to keep 1 to 2 reps in the tank, 2 to 3 reps in the tank. So it gives us a little bit of flexibility there. But the reason that we like that is it gives us some flexibility in loading day to day. I don't know that there's a huge difference in 3% bar load, which a lot of this ends up equating if you get to the higher percentages or the higher ratings of RPE. But oftentimes we'll start most blocks at a moderate RPE or rep in reserve range to get people acclimated to the template. We use that. A lot of my very first blocks in our training plan are pretty consistent. They're 2 or 3 sets across the board, almost regardless of the exercise. It gives me really consistent data based on the effort that the athlete reports to me. And then week 2, we adjust volume accordingly. And we try to get better within those RPE ranges. So it might be, if someone is doing squats, we might look at squats for 5 reps with a RPE range or rep in reserve range of 1 to 2 in the tank. And I want to push their loads as high as we can while maintaining that range. Mm-hmm. I find that if you introduce a lot of variability week to week, it becomes hard to track progress or to gauge progress. I also think most strength athletes need more consistent exposures to similar adaptations in order to fully adapt to it, which is usually the end goal. So I tend to try to get my lifters to get really good in one specific range and then move on from there. And there's always wiggle room to that. That's not a strict rule by any means. But it's very uncommon that I would ever start a training block with 8s and end at 5s. The load swing from that's pretty dramatic. The volume tolerance between that's pretty dramatic. And I would almost use a different training block completely if I were to make that big of a change. Talking about a single exercise, for example.
Would you move? Let's say you went. Would you change the amount of, I guess, sets and volume you would do per RPE compared to the 8 RPE to 9 RPE? Because if you, just for example, if you were to give me only 2 sets at 8 RPE, I'm more likely to go pretty damn heavy on my second one. But if I have 5 sets or so, I know to be conservative.
Yeah.
What's your approach to that?
I think a lot of that comes down to coaching and knowing who you're working with, because there's always, these are broad generalities that we're using here. For example, if I have a guy like Duffin, we're writing his program and he sees that he has 1 set, he will definitely go as heavy as he can on that 1 set. So we almost have to knock him down a couple pegs and start a little bit higher. So I think part of that is knowing your lifter. Another thing that I would do in that situation is try to approximate the bar load as close as I could. So whenever we use RPEs, we're always striving to use a load range with that as well. And the reason that we use a load range with an RPE is to help athletes really zone in on their targets for the day and not go well over or well below. And we use historical data for that. But yeah, if I have a lifter who, a lot of lifters that I've worked with for a long time, I don't have to do something like this because I have a lot of historical data on them too. What I meant by a new training block would be like a new athlete to me. So if I didn't really know what they could tolerate, I didn't know how they would respond, I'm just going to go consistent across the board to gather a little bit of data in their very first week. But if I have someone I've been working with for a long time, like Kyle, I already kind of know where his volume tolerance is from block to block and scheme to scheme.
So are you using that 1 to 5 scale feedback as kind of your gauge to people's recovery from a certain amount of volume?
Kind of. It's an imperfect science for sure. The 1 to 5 scale that we use is a descriptor for effort, and it's not a strict scale. When we implemented it, we wanted to get into the athlete's head a little bit more. So we didn't want to have a strict definition for what every rating is, because we really wanted to see what their perception of effort was. And that's why it's pretty open-ended. So a 1 for us is easy and a 5 is pushing the limit. And we want to just see, to you perceptively, how hard did that feel? How hard do you think it was on a 1 to 5 scale? And it seems to be pretty consistent for most lifters. There's some people who don't utilize it super well. There's others that really overthink it. Both things are fine to us because we aren't always basing all decisions off of it, though. If I see that we're 3 weeks into a block and you're still rating everything 2 out of 5, then things are probably a little bit too easy still, and we need to add a little bit more work or go a little bit heavier.
What about utilizing velocity-based training to predicting load or predicting volume or recoverable volume?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do with velocity. My 2 favorite ways to use velocity are to manage day-to-day loads and also to gauge progress made, as well as fatigue accumulation over the course of a set, a day, or a week. So the way that we would use that, I know you guys know this, but for listeners, the way that you would use velocity for gauging load, the way that I use it is to look at the first rep of a set. I tend to not use the average of a set. It just seems to get a little messy. I'd rather use the first rep. After all, for all of my strength athletes and powerlifters, you usually only get 1 chance on the platform, so you better make your first rep good. And the first rep tends to have quite a bit less noise in the data. So if we were to look at the last rep, it might be more reflective of fatigue accumulation, but not necessarily of performance of the set as a whole. So that's why I choose to use the first rep. And it's as easy as replacing percentages with meters per second rating once you have a velocity profile established. Next way that we would use it is to gauge progress. And this is the best utilization of velocity, in my opinion, because you can measure progress within single percentages. And say week 1, Gus, you were pressing 315 or around 110 kilos. Week 2, you press the same weight. Week 3, maybe you increased it 5 kilos or 10 pounds. It'd be really hard to see if you made any progress there. But if we looked at your velocity and we could see speed improvements, we would know unequivocally that you've adapted and made progress there. And you don't even have to have, Kyle and I were actually just having a side discussion about this. You actually don't even need a velocity profile to use this function of velocity. If you look at a 100th meter of a second, that's roughly 1% bar load. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. So if you go up in speed by 1/100th of a percent, or a meters per second rather, you've gotten about 1% better, which matters, especially for strength athletes.
Yeah. Well, I've started doing, actually, funny you said that, because I started doing that with some of my, 2 of my athletes now. We haven't done a profile, but I said just start tracking, and it's just giving me good data based off how I'm going to progress them week to week.
It's great for people who, as you know, Gus, if for your athletes who don't move consistently, maybe they don't hit consistent squat depth, maybe they round their back and really try and yank deadlifts on lighter weights, their velocity feedback is going to be all over the board, because they're going to have very light, ultra fast reps, and then they're going to get stapled with reps that they should be nailing. So a lot of times I won't even use profiles for those guys, but I will still use velocity to look at their improvements from week to week. And then we'll use velocity loss as a measurement of neuromuscular fatigue over the course of a set or over the course of a week even. A week is a little messy, and you have to be pretty specific with where you're looking at that. But based on velocity loss from set to set, and I'm still looking at the first rep velocity here again, we can gauge the fatigue accumulation that has been accumulated throughout that training session.
So you'll look at, let's say for an example, you had 6-7 sets of bench or whatever, and you'd look at the velocity loss over those sets, or you're looking at all the sets over the entire week?
You can do both. Over the entire week, you just have to have good data collection and management of those to make it useful. I don't typically do it unless I'm really I have so many other indicators, including just talking to athletes. You don't always need a data point. You can just talk to people. But for a lot of our distance clients, it really helps to use velocity loss. And sometimes I don't even program by it. I just want to know what it is so that I can see how much fatigue they've accumulated. Like if I've had guys who do, a 5x5, which to me is kind of a lot of sets. It's not ultra high, but it's not low. It's a decent amount of sets. It's a decent amount of hard sets. Their velocity loss will be very, very low. And it's obviously, even though it's perceptively to me, it seems like a lot of sets, it's not enough for that person. On the other hand, I might have a guy who does 2 to 3 sets and he loses 10% velocity from start to finish, and that's plenty for him. And there's a myriad of reasons that could be caused, whether it's previous training fatigue that's been accumulated, whether it's even their mindset coming in. Maybe they just sandbagged it. Maybe they didn't eat well. Maybe they didn't sleep well. Maybe they're just trying to rush to get out of there. There's a lot of factors that influence that.
I think you're right what you said before that. And I guess something I've noticed too when you're collecting huge amounts of data is still come back to the roots of all the subjective data I collect just simply by talking to them, getting their biofeedback, how their life's going, stress and things like that.
Yeah, that's super important. I like it'd be nice to have the perfect data metric for everything, but it just doesn't exist. You want to have a handful of really actionable data points that can drive decision making. And then beyond that, you have a conversation with the person, and that's going to fill in a lot of what's going on with that person.
And Gus, I think that's, I was going to bring up the magic buzzword that people like to talk a lot about, but, heard you bring up, recoverable volume. I was really excited on that as an indicator when it came out. But more and more I've really walked away from it. I wanted to be that guy, like, can we figure out exact amount of maximum recoverable volume for each athlete and each type of athlete, from fighters to powerlifters, all this. And right now I feel like it's even better climate to bring that up, because with all of the extra stressors in life, I might have, you or my own training, somebody else who can normally handle a bunch of training. And then all of a sudden 1 week, that data went out the window. And it goes back to, I have these pieces, I have the volume I know that I like to push them at, or what I think they can handle, but the conversation still needs to come back to, where are they currently at, physically, mentally, rest, recovery, sleep, how is this all tying together, especially once again in this current climate. It could be just the stress of somebody thinking about losing their gym, or their gym shutting down again and not having a place to train. That whole session's gone. So recoverable volume in a perfect world, yes, I think it's a better indicator and better data, but we're not in test tubes, right? And with a lot of extra stress and other issues going on, I feel like that's less and less important right now, and more so just speaking with the athlete and looking what they're doing on not a day-to-day basis, but quick snapshot of a week, but more weeks compared to each other's. A bigger snapshot would be a month, but keeping a close eye on that so we can monitor it and make it customized for that individual athlete.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think that through, but obviously the current climate will be causing a hell of a lot of stress for a lot of people, and that all makes sense, right? And that as a knock-on effect, people are losing sleep. It all kind of goes out the window, right? I didn't think that through, but yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I was going through kind of the exact same thing with it's like, is there a way to exactly calculate maximal recoverable volume from this? And a few attempts of it, the same things kind of happened. Things just got thrown out the window when things change, and just go back to my old methodology of just being, well, like you said, Brandon, just talking to them, and then you kind of get the best gauge and make the best decision based off all the information you know about them, or just how you know them as an athlete.
I think looking at someone's acute to chronic workload ratio is probably more useful than their maximum recoverable volume. Although they're two very similar topics, but they are slightly different. The chronic to acute workload ratio, your chronic workload is a rolling average of work, however you choose to define work. It could be volume, it could be number of hard sets, it could be some combination of volume and difficulty. There's a few ways that you could potentially quantify work. If you really wanted to quantify work, you would probably use range of motion and loads to quantify work. That would be more accurate, but we don't have the ability to really do that unless some velocity devices do spit out work as a metric. I think GymWare does. There's probably other ones that do. And then we look at the acute spikes of workload within there, and that gives us a very accurate picture of what type of a stimulus is applied comparatively to what the athlete has been exposed to. So if somebody's acute stimulus or acute workload has been doubled, we'll see that huge spike over their chronic. Their chronic workload should be right around the acute, if not slightly lower most of the time, because it is a rolling average. But it's going to tell us more or less how the trend over time has affected that athlete. And then we can overlay the average load increases during that time. And I think that's a very good way to look at what type of stimulus has been applied to what individual and the magnitudes therein. Like if someone keeps getting beat up and you're like, yeah, I mean, you're still only squatting once a week or whatever, but maybe you didn't catch 3 weeks ago that they went from squatting, once a week to twice a week, and you maybe unintentionally doubled their volume of their knee extensors, and that caused knee pain or something. You'd be able to see that in a graph like that, which is why I think it's useful.
Do you think something like that would be more contributed to not sometimes just volume, but just the frequency itself?
Yeah, it could be. There's, fatigue is a thing that's not easily quantifiable because there's many things that influence it. It's like many people use the analogy of stress, and you only have a bucket so big that you can dump it into before it overflows. Fatigue's pretty similar. It's hard to determine what appreciable fatigue is or what too little fatigue is. I think frequency does matter, but if you squat 135 every day, nothing's going to happen to you. So it's kind of about figuring out where that level of appreciable stimulus starts and ends, and then trying to balance a week within that context, because you still got to fit other things in there.
Would you consider progress within chronic fatigue? So, I mean, personally, like when I especially coming into comp prep, where people are starting to, you can tell they're getting more and more fatigued, but then they seem to get a little bit weaker, but then start to get stronger again whilst in, because they're showing all the signs of fatigue, but because we come into competition, I'm keeping them going because I know we're going to start to pull back and restore them coming into competition. Is there something you guys similarly do? Keep them in fatigue?
Yeah, it depends on the person. Kyle's laughing because he's probably that person. It depends on who we have. The only time I try not to do that is if the individual that I'm working with has a history of injuries specific to the movements they're doing. So if I have a guy who has, debilitating bicep pain when they bench press and squat, or they have terrible knee pain when they squat and then it creeps into their deadlifts, I'm not going to push their fatigue thresholds that high. They're just going to continue to train within their tolerable range. It's kind of a nice tool to have in your back pocket to try to ease along supercompensation, but it's a risky thing. You have to do kind of a risk analysis before you use that with somebody. If I have a healthy individual and they're progressing in their average loading, I'm okay, going with 1 or 2 really hard weeks where we're going to push you beyond your recovery capabilities, and then we'll go into a more controlled taper period. But the other part of that too is, the other side of that is it's challenging to gauge taper length and a reduction in volume if you're consistently changing training plan, work, and volume. If somebody is carrying dramatically varied levels of fatigue, it can be very hard to gauge at what point that you take away training load does your training adaptation decay too quickly. So for example, if I have someone who's squatting 5 times a week, which I haven't had too many people ever do that. If I did though, and then I had them go to 0 times a week because it was a deload, they would decay very, very quickly in their training adaptation. So when it comes to doing things like overload weeks or impact weeks, or weeks that force the athlete to reach beyond an overreaching week, reach beyond their recovery capabilities, you just have to be mindful, as well as what the taper length is going to be and how effective that can actually be implemented.
I think one of the other important pieces in there, not to sound like I'm jumping down the psychology road all day here, right? But we're talking a lot of science and theory. On the other side of it, and Gus, you know this real well from your own training, if I have an athlete who can take that, physically is one thing, right? I can't break my athlete. But if they can take it mentally, and they know that if they push and numbers drop a little bit and they stick to the course, they're going to springboard and they're probably going to hit some best numbers ever. If the athlete's not that mentally tough and they can't handle seeing numbers drop, regardless of what I want to gain out of super compensation, I might have just tanked them mentally before the meet, before competition, and now it's worse off because they're second guessing everything. Or on that same note, it got so tough they don't want to play anymore, and they're like, I can't keep pushing at this rate. I'm done. I've given up, and they pull back to protect themselves or their own mental state. So it really kind of becomes, knowing your athlete once again, and knowing, can I push them physically that hard, but me mentally that hard? Will they come out better on the other end? Duffin's a good example of that. His last squat cycle, I saw him struggle a couple times mentally, but he always comes out 10 times stronger on the other side. right? He will prevail. You can't stop that guy. A beginner athlete, maybe their first or second meet, that could be them never competing again. So,
yeah, I find you look at the entire athlete's career that, you know, I have this kind of endpoint where, you know, at an elite level, when they get closer to a competition, I know they know the result of what is going to come from their training and how they're going to feel, and they had that expectation. I kind of a similar thing where from competition to competition, I'm pushing that barrier closer and closer and closer, but also using the competition as a way to get to have enough drive to push through some of the very high volume, high intensity stuff, because they have the motivation to get to that competition, regardless. Whether if there's something like that in the off season, I mean, it's pretty easy to just want to stop.
I definitely agree with all of that. I think part of it too comes down to transparency in the intent of training. Because if you just blow someone up who might not be super mentally resilient, they might assume that they should just, you know, training's just going as normal, and they don't know why they're, you know, getting more beat up or hurt. And I've had a few athletes who it's been pretty disastrous with, that we've tried that with, but you know, you just kind of learn working with different personalities as well, who can tolerate what, and when it's appropriate to really push and when it's a good idea to hold back.
I think that, do you guys have systems of profiling individuals?
We, outside of our athlete profile, we don't have specific systems for categorizing athletes. So our athlete profiles are going to ask quite a few questions amongst their training history, goals, experience, expectations, and things of that nature. And of course, we look at their movements. So I like the idea of having like a hierarchy of categories that people fit into, but I also feel like it's hard to define the complexity of a person and how they interact with a training plan or anything, and it is subject to change as well. One thing I've been really interested in is personality typing for strength training plans. I haven't done a ton of work on it, but it's always been something that's been kind of in the back of my mind that I think could be interesting. You know, there's many different people communicate differently. Some people like to be taught exhaustively. People like to know the whys behind things. Other people, they don't even want to hear you talk and they just want the plan. And so you're going to drive away 50% of those people if you keep your language the same across all people. It also comes down to what type of training program they have. Some personalities seek variety more often. Some personalities seek a higher intensity of not necessarily training load, but a higher intensity in terms of output. There are people who don't necessarily love the process. They love the outcome. And those, again, are two separate personalities that will respond slightly differently to a training plan. They'll still do the same stuff, but if I have Duffin, again, is a good example of this because he's an egomaniac, and if you tell him, oh, you know, trust the process, enjoy the process, he doesn't want to do it. He's a guy who likes to compete every single day, and if you don't give him an outlet to compete, you know, they become bored. It feels more like a chore. Training isn't the same type of an outlet. So understanding the personality of the person you have in front of you is pretty important. And for the athlete sizes, in terms of the amount of athletes our coaches are working with, we get to know them on a pretty individual basis. So I haven't really found the need to create that yet, but I think it could be something very, very useful, especially to get new athletes paired with the proper coach.
I found the personality profiling quite interesting. It's something I have started to look into quite a bit, and it kind of explains some of the phenomenon I see. And like you've said, you can start to know the people who are highly competitive, people who respond better to volume, people who like intensity, who like variety, who like consistency. And these personality types have been a really good way to gauge, because they used to fit. It fits with their personality type seemed to fit a certain neurotransmitter profile, which then had a response to, which had a favorable, I guess, what they enjoy doing, enjoy training. So if they're competitive, they're competitive in nature, they tend to want to push themselves with intensity. And some of the stuff I've been looking to is that they're starting to have a nervous system response to training. So who recovers well from intensity, who recovers well from volume, or who finds themselves bored, or people with high anxiety will require more static, steady programming, where someone who is a novelty seeker would want something different, changes in competition. So I personally have found it, I've only looked into it in the last 2 years or so, and have found it explained a lot of things which kind of just was left to intuition to now having a science.
For sure. As a good coach too, you have that intuition. I think all good coaches, they have experience, but they also have an intuition when presented a certain amount of variables within a person. But yeah, I think it could be really useful. And it's not to say that your personality might not, and I don't really know the answer to this, it may or may not directly influence physiologically how a stimulus changes you. But if you enjoy the training more, you're likely to try to get to bed a little earlier. Yep. You're likely to enjoy all of the other things. You're likely to take an extra step in your movement work. And that combined makes a much more effective plan. If you're more excited to get to the gym, if you're just a happier person in general, your training is probably going to go better because you have less surrounding fatigue. So I think it's something that's pretty interesting. And that's probably one of the next bigger areas, I think, that'll be broken into in the online coaching type world.
Yeah, for sure. I found it. I think you probably hit it on the head there, and I think this is just the approach of even before all this is just need to enjoy training, or you're just not going to come in with the right intent.
Yeah,
and make more progression.
I found too that because we've done some personality testing here at our company, just from a company standpoint, to get to know our employees better. And it kind of gets you, if you know your results of your personality test, it can even get you to get to know yourself a little bit better, why you have certain tendencies or biases, and can help you kind of overcome difficulties you may have in communicating with other people. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic that I am not nearly well versed enough in.
I was about to say that there are significant parallels there with what they do in the corporate world. But I mean, they tend to use it as a mechanism to try and get people to not enjoy a job, but perform well in a job that they fundamentally don't want. They don't want to fucking be there, right? So they obviously do a lot. Like this character profiling is coming in a lot in workplaces, because if you don't want to be there, especially, I mean, I don't understand anybody who wants to sit in a cubicle, but I mean, if you really don't want to be there, like that's a massive way for you to work out how to motivate those people to do that. And it's done a lot in kind of the corporate world. So it is an interesting crossover potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And so much now too, with social media and things like that, everybody has a unique voice. It's not like 50 years ago where you fit or you starve. So yeah, I think it's something that will probably grow in popularity across many strength coaches.
I guess to change topic a little bit, there's something that I personally wanted to learn, understand more. Now, I have been getting people to work. I watch a lot of your stuff on footwork and how we get, we start getting a lot more people to how to utilize their feet a little bit better in all their lifts. What are some of the, I guess, methods to someone who has a very weak foot or very hard to control? I mean, are there specific exercises or things that you do to help specifically just the foot itself?
Yeah, there definitely is. So the foot, just like any other area of the body, has to be strong and mobile. Feet are not just pegs to be stood upon. They should be muscular. They should be able to bend and flex and grab. And many people's feet can't do that for a lot of reasons. The biggest one of which is shoes are designed by companies to look good, not function well. Nike shoes are absolutely terrible, even though that's the only shoe I wear because Kyle keeps giving me free Nikes that he doesn't want to wear. I think I've gone through like 8 pairs of Metcons now that Kyle doesn't want.
This is a true story.
But I spend enough time barefoot too that it doesn't really matter, and I've never had an issue. But a lot of people also choose shoes based on their length and not even their width. And width is just as important as length, if not even more so. And that's a good thing it's not the Mark Bell podcast, because that discussion might have gone in a different direction. Anyway, we're back on track. Yeah, there's a lot of useful foot drills to do. I mean, the simplest thing is to be barefoot more. Obviously, that's not going to solve all of your problems. You are going to have to do some, if your feet are really locked up, if you have toes that kind of overlap, or if you can't spread your toes without the aid of your hands or other implements, then you probably need your feet to be a bit more mobile and strong. If you can't control your arch through supination and pronation, you probably need stronger feet. Your foot should not just be a big arch. It should be able to maintain contact with the ground through ranges of supination or like rolling to the outside. You should still be able to maintain contact, and you should still be able to maintain contact in pronation. It's anytime we see someone who rolls their foot to the inside or to the outside and it looks like a 2x4 that just kind of rolls, that's a big problem. And it tells us that their foot is very immobile, it's very structurally weak, and they're likely have very bound up ankles, because ankle mobility is a complete output of your foot strength and mobility. It doesn't have much to do with anything else. And if your feet are structurally weak, your ankle tightens up to prevent you from going into potentially harmful ranges of motion for your knees and for your hips. So all these things are connected, right? And we find that there's a really close connection between how the foot functions and how the hip functions. If we have dysfunction at the hip, you're almost always going to see it at the foot as well. Almost always. If you have plantar fasciitis, you probably have glutes that don't work really well either. So there's not a single area of the body that is completely isolated in function. It's all a system. It's all works in coordination, and your feet are especially true to that, which is why we focus so much of our education around improving foot strength, mobility. Kyle can probably talk more to the anatomy of the foot and why that's important, but there's some huge number of muscles in the foot, huge number of bones, all of which need to move and function as units. And we find that people who have either spent tons of time training in like Chuck Taylor's, or they have maybe they have spent a lot of time wearing more business type shoes that tend to be more for looks than function, they have a lot of work to do to overcome that. So there's tons of drills. I don't know that I can name a single one that I love more than anything else. I'm a huge fan of barefoot split squats, hip airplanes, barefoot squats, things that intentionally load yourself in a minimal environment.
So basically, if they can just train more on bare feet, they would build better function. Yeah,
that's a huge component to it. I don't think it's a catch-all, because if you have very egregious or very poor hip function or foot function, it's not going to improve just by being barefoot.
Yeah,
if you're 350 pounds and you walk like a duck, like and you never address the root causes, it's being barefoot is not going to help you.
Yeah, and those are the problem ones that I guess I come across, because I get a lot of my athletes pretty much training bare feet, and it's the ones that come in, and usually the business guys or business women who are constantly in shoes and have a very, very dysfunctional foot, and no amount of bare feet or cueing or anything is changing that, even to the point where I try to get them. I even get them to think about. I had one chick just try to get her to think about a tripod foot, and instantly cramps. So what about individuals like that? Is there any release work or exercises straight away where someone's that dysfunctional that they just cramp?
Yeah. Cramping is a sign of a very weak foot. And anytime someone, even at our seminars, we have a lot of people who this is a new topic too, and they start doing some foot drills, their foot immediately cramps up and becomes tight. I'm like, dude, your feet are super weak. Like I'm very blunt with it too. I'm like, it's not because you're dehydrated. It's not because of this. It's literally because your foot is very weak and can't control that position. So, but with anything, it's about scaling load appropriately and spending more time in joint angles and positions that they struggle in. So for the foot, it's very easy to stand barefoot. It's very easy just to kind of stand here and do nothing. But as soon as you introduce hip flexion or ankle flexion, standing barefoot becomes much harder. So we spend time going through segments of movement and spending time within those segments to get better at those positions. We can torture them with different foot strength drills, whether they're with bands or whether they are even with towels grabbing them, or even motor control type drills. But if someone's cramping up a lot, it's a really good sign that they need to do more footwork. Like, your feet really should not cramp after minimal activity like that. So there's a ton of things you can do, but I tend to just go to spending more time in those positions that they struggle in.
It's an interesting point bringing up, cramping. And I have to supersede this with intent. I think intent's one thing. So, a lot of people know us for our footwork and how diligent we are on the feet. It's like anything else. An athlete has to have buy-in to that. If they kind of believe it, but they don't really, they're like, yeah, whatever, feet, and I'm just going to go stand up and down with the bar on my back. If they don't put the intent in, they'll never get better. We can show them rooting drills. We can show them, one of my favorites, putting the floss band underneath their foot and pulling on it while they're squatting. That's great when I have them in person, but then if I watch them squat 2 weeks later and they're just standing up and down off their feet, they don't either have the buy-in or they're not putting the intent into it. So a lot of foot dysfunction, regardless of how they got it, shoes, whatever the case may be, they don't sit a lot, they sit a lot, they don't walk around a lot, dress shoes, whatever created this dysfunction. I don't have any specific foot exercises that I do because I simply want them to get better in the specific movement, like Brandon. So we have a bunch of different drills, but as far as exercises, and I just pulled it up on my Instagram, the only time I prescribe specific foot exercises is if we have foot pain and dysfunction, as in like a plantar fasciitis, something like that. So as a reference point, you can go peek at those. Any listeners can go peek at those. It is on the Kabuki Virtual Coaching. It's also on my page. We did part 1, 2, and 3 of foot and lower leg pain and dysfunction. And it covers soft tissue, some of our KMS principles, some stretches, some unique stretches and strengthening drills. But really, any starting place I would tell any athlete is you have to understand why your foot's so important. And every single rep, if you're not good at rooting, every single rep, you have to be mindful and very intent in making your foot do its job and do it good and making it do its job better, or it's simply never going to get better because it's just this post that you're standing on and you're just pushing to the ground and standing up and down.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. How much dysfunction you can find throughout the body just from starting with the foot, or working from the bottom up.
That's why we've got such great results over time. With that area. People think we're magic, but it's just your foot. I'm not telling you, and that's why I don't have specific strengthening exercises. I don't have this one magic foot exercise. Just simply, please use your foot better and make it healthier, and you'll get great results.
I guess there is, we're coming close to our hour mark. There is one question I've been starting to ask everyone, because it's been a hot topic here in Australia, and it's been, I guess, annoying me or triggering me. What is your guys' views on shin angle on the deadlift?
Is that specific to, I have to ask, I think I know where you're going with this, but I have to ask, is that specific to conventional or deadlift or both? Sorry, conventional or sumo or both?
Conventional.
I think it really depends on the femur length and probably the torso length of the person. I think if you have somebody, and there's other factors that likely influence too, including the depth of someone's hip capsule. So depth of hip capsule and how far the femur can articulate in the hip capsule is largely going to determine how deep somebody can squat with a neutral shin and an upright torso. So there's many factors that influence that position. I don't think that it's similarly to squat stance. I don't know that there is a single position that's best. I don't think a parallel up and down shin is achievable by many people. But I also don't think a knees forward position is good. There's something right in the middle that is, I almost look at hip position and the position of the spine more than anything. I want the hips to be, I wouldn't say as low as possible, but low with a neutral spine. That doesn't mean squatting, because at some point it's usually going to be about slightly lower than an RDL position to where they start to round their back. Sometimes they can push their knees forward a little bit to get a little bit more, but usually not. So I almost don't ever look at shin position unless it's something really egregious. But I think factors in femur length, the depth of hip capsule, and the torso length really matter for how parallel someone's shin can be, as well as even just their height and arm length. Those are also huge factors. So I don't know that there's any one indicator and not one best position. It's certainly a very small range of acceptable tolerance, I believe. That's okay.
Yeah, I have a hard time with any lift, bench, squat, deadlift, overhead press, any lift, looking at one specific thing. And years ago, when I was a younger coach and younger trainer, I thought there was that one magic angle for like the powerlifting squat. And I quickly learned over time that there's not. One of the things I think that Kabuki does pretty good, especially when it comes to hot topics like this, you probably won't find us very far on one side or the other. And that goes right into my discussion of range. One of our my favorite slides from our seminars is a range scale, right? So somewhere in here would be an optimal, I almost said perfect, an optimal position for the spine. We could carry this conversation over to shins. Most people would probably agree that somewhere in here is the best. When you get too far this way or too far that way, it's just too extreme, and it's not going to be good for you. One of the other things that, on that same note, that changes my mind is, the individual will change over time. And like myself, and I'm getting slightly off topic here, but with a sumo stance, in my sumo, it's changed over time. I used to think that I have this perfect stance. Well, my hips are tighter than they used to be, and I can't pull from that stance that I used to. But I'm a stronger athlete. So is my new stance better or my old one? I don't know. They both worked for me at one point in time. Mm-hmm. My conventional stance has also changed over time. I think it used to be a better stance, but I'm a stronger athlete now. So can we really determine which one was better? Yeah, and that's where I won't weigh in too far on one side, because even there's a lot of individuality between different athletes, but even in our own body, as we gain weight, as we lose weight, our leverages might need to be slightly different, which puts us in a different position. Mm-hmm. And one of the other reasons I'm really not picky on stuff like this, I personally don't get a lot of change from shin angle, especially with most intermediate or lower level lifters. There's so much more that I see that they're doing wrong, like the foot, right? Or they're breathing and bracing. I think I can get a lot more out of spending my time and energy there versus chasing the ideal shin angle or the ideal, squat stance, going back to squat as an example. So to recap, for me, there's probably a pretty good angle that most strength coaches could agree on. This would be worse. This would be worse. Somewhere in here is probably closer to better. But that's also going to change over time as an athlete grows and ages and does other things in their career. I think we could be probably better off as strength coaches chasing our big fish first and making sure breathing, bracing, rooting, our big players are hammered down before looking at, making our athletes stand in some obscure perfect angle.
I think that's the perfect answer.
Yeah.
The answer.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah, I think the problem is over here people are one side or the other, and it's like being part of a political party. Like they're almost fighting with each other over what's best. It's crazy.
The answer is always sometimes somewhere in the middle of left and right.
Yeah, and some of these, and not to pick on any coaches because I don't know anybody particular in this argument, but if you looked at some of their athletes, you could probably be like, okay, that's a nice conversation about the shin angle, but they're doing step 1 and 2 horribly wrong. I think the shin angle can wait. Can we just teach them good deadlift technique before we worry about a shin angle?
I always looked at it, and what you said, Brendan, like anatomy matters the most, and I always have what's the I kind of look at things. What is the end range of the most optimal optimal mechanical, gives you the most mechanical advantage to what is functional, and and I'm always working within those ranges. Like there's that end goal which I may never reach, but then there's always like what's functional for the athlete right now, and then we make those steps towards year after year what direction we go towards.
Yeah. There's a difference between what a idealized skeleton looks like in a deep squat or a deadlift versus what people look like. You know, I think an ideal squat is like just a barely forward knee position, not past toes, probably knots of your shoes, pretty near vertical shin, not quite very upright torso. These are some of the strongest squatters in existence, but not many people can do that. And it's not because they don't have good mobility. They don't have good morphology to do that. So, you know, that's, I think a lot of the, you know, even things like starting strength, a lot of the education surrounding that is through idealized leverages, but it doesn't, it looks at lengths of like femur length, torso length, shin length, and then say, based on these mechanical leverages, this is the ideal position for maximum torque, but they don't include hip depth, the capsular depth, contour of the hip, many other factors that influence how deep somebody can squat, as just another example. So I think there's not one ideal position for anybody to be in. There's an ideal range of joint angles a person can be in, but that's not every single person, for sure.
This is a good conversation.
And again, keep in mind that changes for an athlete over time with their career, whether they're gaining weight, losing weight, just, you know, again, we're talking life stressors, right? How tight are their muscles? How's the length tension relationship from front to back? Let alone if my athletes are getting bigger or smaller, right? Your leverage has just changed. So now you might have to manipulate. I can't lift like I used to at 165. I'm just a bigger lifter.
Yeah, I think, and that, you know, just a final point on that too. If you look at two elite squatters that come to mind of really opposing styles is David Wilson and John Hack. If you look at David Wilson, I mean, he is stretching out his power rack with how wide his feet are. He only weighs, I think he might be a 231 competitor. I think he's only at 205 though. But he is essentially squatting like you would squat in a multiply suit, but that's just how his hips function. And if we look at guys like John Hack, who have a very narrow stance, knees are past their toes, they're still squatting close to 800 pounds, 750 pounds. So you can't tell me that one style is idealized over the other, because there's so many individual components to morphology that have to be, and even if it's not morphology, say the way somebody breathes. So if I have somebody who is, you know, really locked up, a real chest breather, their thoracic spine is going to become less and less mobile over time. That person probably squats a little bit differently because of that, not even just their limb length. So there's too many things to consider, and that's why we never promote the Kabuki strength style of squatting or deadlifting. We use guiding principles to inform positions, and those are: you got to brace well, you got to breathe well, you got to have strong and mobile feet, and then there's other things, of course, with shoulders and hips. But you know, do those things right, and your body's usually going to do the right thing.
What a great answer.
Yeah, I think that is the perfect approach. Yeah.
I just have to highlight that real quick because Brandon stole my answer. But to highlight it, because it is very important. We see, you know, people come to our seminars. Hey, can you teach me, you know, how Chris Duffin squats? Can you teach me the Kabuki squat? And we're like, there is no such thing, because, and it's great there because we have, you know, athletes of all different shapes and sizes. But we stick to our principles and, you know, our 5-step setup process, if you will, for squat, for example, and it leads great results across all athlete types, body shapes, and sizes. So we're not teaching the Kabuki way because there is no Kabuki squat. We're teaching you the principles to be successful in your own body, once again, as it changes over time.
Yes, I always find you seem to find yourself stuck in a stigma sometimes of like your method. And because I do things slightly different here, usually just because it's based off evidence, and some old school ways that still exist around here. And so it's like, oh, that is your method, and you're going to get stuck with that stigma. But the thing is, no answer was right or wrong. It's just sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong, depending on the individual.
Right.
So
yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. Well,
Cool. Yeah, we're probably gonna have to wrap it up. We're into an hour and 10 territory now. So that was awesome. I barely contributed. I just sat there listening, taking it in. That was brilliant.
Thank you so much, guys, for giving us the time to run one of these. So can't wait to put this one up.
Yeah,
It's
really
always a
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.